Right, so Jai Opetaia and this low IQ statement that he made. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. The low IQ statement that Jai Opetaia made about future fights and things like that. When he was asked about names, he was asked in a recent interview about the names he wants to fight. And his reply was that it's not about the names. I want to be undisputed. That's what it's about, being undisputed, right? This thing about being undisputed, it's garbage. It's very low IQ to think that you've got to hold 4 or 5 bouts, however many there are, because it's meaningless. There's several examples of this. Terence Crawford at 140, he fought trash opposition, became undisputed, right, but holding all the belts. But who did he beat? Victor Postol was the best opponent he fought at 140. Once he left 140, guys like Josh Taylor and Prograde came along that would have been much more, credible opposition. But the guys Terence Crawford beat at 140 to become undisputed, apart from Postol, and Postol himself, not a great fighter, decent but not great, right? Devin Haney, aka the most boring fighter in the history of the sport. This guy became undisputed by beating George Kambosos, right? Who's just the average boxer, a guy that had a good night against Teofimo Lopez, won all the bouts off him, and then Devin Haney, the most boring fighter in history, beat Kambosos. Now, does that mean Devin Haney was the best guy at 135? Absolutely not. Another example of how this is meaningless is Haney getting a win over Lomachenko, which was a robbery win. So how much does being undisputed mean if you only have to beat one guy, right? How much does it mean if you get a robbery win? How much does it mean if the opponents you beat to become undisputed, like Crawford, were average opposition? It doesn't mean anything. There's other reasons as well as that. Here's another one. What if there's a guy trying to become undisputed, right, hold all the belts, but one guy doesn't want to fight him, and he gets injured and this and that, and the fight between the two guys can't be made? Maybe the promoters don't get along or whatever. Are you going to say that, oh well, this guy's not undisputed because he hasn't got all the belts, when one guy is ducking the fight? You know what I mean? Like Jai Opetaia, really, Zurdo Ramirez should be fighting Jai Opetaia, right? But if he ducks Opetaia, which it looks like he's done, and avoids the fight, and Opetaia doesn't become undisputed, are you going to hold that against Opetaia? I mean, again, it would be very low IQ, very dumb to hold that against Opetaia, right? Because he's being ducked. So it doesn't make sense. My point is, this idea of undisputed, meaning you've got to hold all the titles, it's just a silly idea. It's a low IQ idea, because the fights that need to be made for you to collect all 4 or 5 titles, it might not happen. You know, no matter how hard you try, it might not happen that you're able to make these fights and win all the bouts, you know, or one guy is ducking, right? Or you don't, you know, there's examples of guys not wanting to pay sanctioning fees, which fair enough, you know, these sanctioning bodies are charging them money just to hold their belt, and then they decide, no, I don't want to pay that, so I'll drop the belt. I mean, does that make you less of a fighter because you've dropped the belt, dropped the title? You know, if you hold all the belts, 4 or 5 belts in your division, and you're called undisputed, but then a sanctioning body, say the WBC, is charging you $500,000 to remain the champion, you know, sanctioning fees, I don't know how much they charge, but let's just say 500 grand, 100 grand, whatever, and you drop their belt because you don't want to pay it, are you now not undisputed because you dropped the belt? You know what I mean? So this undisputed, it doesn't mean anything. You know, yes, if everything goes to plan, you can win all the belts and be called undisputed, but at the end of the day, it's not what matters. What matters is you fighting the best opposition. You know, the guys you fight do matter. That is what matters. You know, fighting Benavidez and Ramirez, that matters, right? But Opetaia at this point is definitely the undisputed cruiserweight champion. There's no dispute that he's the best guy at cruiserweight based on his record, based on who he's beat. You know, Breedis was the second best guy at cruiserweight. Opetaia beat the guy twice. You know, very competitive fights. But, you know, just by Opetaia winning those fights against Breedis, I consider him the best at cruiserweight until proven otherwise. So there's no dispute about who's the best. Opetaia is the best, you know, but he's got a low IQ when it comes to thinking about he needs to collect all the belts, because that's just not the case. And it's just, as I said, you know, it's low IQ. It's silly for these guys to think I need to collect all the belts to be considered this. No, you don't, right? And the other thing about the guys you're fighting, that's what really matters. You know, what do we as boxing fans, what do we recall from the past? We recall the great fights. You know, nobody gives a shit about, oh, this guy, he didn't hold the WBC belt. That guy, he didn't have the IBF, so I've got to mark him down. No, nobody cares about that. We remember the great fights. That's what puts you in the history books. Okay? Yes, things can be mentioned about your title reign, how many years you were champion, how many defenses you had, all of this. Yes, that can be in the conversation, but what really matters is the guys you fight. You know, what made Pacquiao the legend that he is not the fact that he held this belt and that belt. Nobody cares about that. People care about Pacquiao fighting Morales 3 times, right? Barrera twice, Marquez 4 times, Mayweather, Cotto, Mosley, you know, the list goes on. Bradley 3 times. Pacquiao has a legacy, right? A great legacy, because he was in there with all the best fighters, and some of them multiple times, and had great fights, right? That's what is remembered. You know, you can't Nobody cares about what belts Ali held, you know, Cassius Clay. What we care about is the fights he had, you know, fighting Joe Frazier, Foreman, you know. This is what really matters. Sugar Ray Leonard against Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard against Hagler, Hearns, right? Duran, Hagler. The big matchups, the best versus the best. That's what we care about. That's what builds your legacy. It's not, oh, look at me, I've got the WBC belt. Nobody gives a shit about that. Nobody gives a shit how many belts you've got. If you're the best, you're beating the best opponents, that's what matters. The names, right? The names is what matters. It's not about belts. It's not about being undisputed, right? It's not about that. It's about who you beat. It's about the names you beat, the legacy of great fights you had. That's what it's really about. You know, so people, they've been talking about this undisputed thing for years now, but it's all bullshit at the end of the day. You know, these titles, they don't mean anything, right? They don't mean anything. What matters is you fighting the best. Okay, I'm sick of hearing boxers talk about, oh, I don't care who I fight, I want to be undisputed. I want to get the belt. That's all that matters. I don't care about the names. You should care about the names. Your legacy is built on the names you fight, right? So that's my point of view. Let me know what you think.